In the dimly lit command deck of the Carina, Captain Alec Frost stood before his crew, hands clasped behind his back. The room buzzed with restrained anticipation, the air thick with the scent of sweat and adrenaline. His eyes scanned the assembly, taking in their anxious faces. "We're heading towards the Celestia," he began, voice steady and measured. "She's a ghost ship, derelict for years. Our mission is clear: investigate, salvage, and report any valuable cargo." He paused, letting the gravity of their task sink in. "But remember, she's been silent for a reason. We're walking into the unknown, and we must proceed with caution." A murmur of assent rippled through the crew. Frost nodded, satisfied. He turned to the hulking form of the Celestia displayed on the main screen, an eerie silhouette against the star-studded backdrop. His heart quickened at the sight, a potent mix of dread and exhilaration coursing through his veins. The thrill of the unknown never truly faded, even after years spent traversing the vast expanse of space. As they suited up, Frost found himself lost in thought, his fingers tracing the worn insignias on his uniform. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were venturing into a tomb, disturbing the rest of the unfortunate souls who had once called the Celestia home. Shaking off the morbid thought, he focused on the task at hand. The airlock sealed behind them with an ominous hiss, and the crew stepped into the cold, dark corridors of the Celestia. The oppressive silence weighed heavy on their shoulders, broken only by the soft hum of their equipment and their own ragged breaths. Frost's boots echoed on the metal flooring, the sound reverberating through the empty ship like a mournful dirge. His heart pounded in his chest as he led the way, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The crew followed closely, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The walls of the Celestia seemed to close in around them, the narrow passages creating a sense of claustrophobic unease. Frost couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease, his instincts screaming that they were intruders in a place better left forgotten. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the mission. They had a job to do, and he would ensure his crew completed it safely. But as the darkness pressed in, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the Celestia held secrets it desperately wanted to keep. Together, they moved deeper into the ship, each step a testament to their determination and courage. Frost couldn't help but wonder what awaited them in the bowels of the Celestia, and if they would ever truly be prepared for the horrors that lurked within. The third engineer's quarters loomed ahead, a haunting testament to the lives that once occupied the Celestia. Captain Alec Frost's flashlight illuminated the space, revealing personal belongings strewn about, photos of loved ones, half-empty mugs of congealed coffee, and a torn book whose pages fluttered in the stale air. A chill ran down Frost's spine as he scanned the room, his boots crunching on shattered glass. Katarina Holm, the security chief, whispered, "Captain, look at this." She pointed to a series of gouges etched into the metal wall, as if something had desperately tried to claw its way out. "Or in," Frost murmured, his voice barely audible. The implications of their discovery weighed heavily on him. He steeled himself, knowing they had to press on. As the crew moved deeper into the derelict vessel, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The once pristine corridors now bore the scars of a brutal struggle. Torn cables dangled from the ceiling, and pools of dried blood stained the floor. Frost's heart raced as he tried to piece together what had transpired aboard the Celestia. Suddenly, Zeke Freeman, the ship's mechanic, tensed. "Captain, I'm picking up movement on my sensors, 20 meters ahead." Frost's grip tightened on his sidearm as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Stay alert, everyone," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. Stick together and watch each other's backs." The crew nodded, their eyes reflecting a mix of determination and apprehension. Frost took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that the nightmarish creatures lurking in the shadows were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But he couldn't let his fear control him. He was their captain, and it was his responsibility to lead them through this harrowing ordeal. With a steely resolve, Frost pushed forward, the darkness of the Celestia seeming to close in around them as they ventured deeper into the unknown. The vast cargo hold loomed before them, a labyrinth of crates and shadows that seemed to swallow the feeble light from their helmet lamps. Captain Alec Frost's heart pounded in his chest as he led his crew through the maze, their boots echoing ominously in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, a constant reminder of the Celestia's slow descent into oblivion. "Spread out and search for any salvageable cargo," Frost ordered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But stay within sight of each other. We don't know what's lurking in these shadows." As the crew fanned out, Frost couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He scanned the darkness, his fingers tightening around the grip of his sidearm. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hiss of escaping air and the occasional clang of a shifting crate. Elena Martinez, the ship's medic, suddenly called out, "Captain, over here, I've found a cache of medical supplies." Frost's pulse quickened at the prospect of finding something valuable amidst the wreckage. He hurried over to Martinez, who was already prying open a crate with her multi-tool. As she lifted the lid, a faint gleam of silver caught Frost's eye. "Looks like we've hit the jackpot," Martinez said, a note of relief in her voice. "These supplies could be worth a fortune back home." But before Frost could respond, a chilling sound echoed through the cargo hold, a series of guttural clicks and hisses that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The crew froze, their eyes wide with terror. "Get back!" Frost barked, his instincts screaming at him to run. "We've got to get out of here now!" As if on cue, the nightmarish creatures emerged from the shadows, their serpentine bodies slithering through the narrow gaps between the crates. Frost's blood ran cold at the sight of their razored appendages and malevolent, multifaceted eyes. "Move!" he roared, shoving Martinez ahead of him. The crew sprinted towards the exit, their hearts pounding in unison. But the creatures were relentless, their eerie coordination allowing them to outmaneuver and outflank the humans with terrifying ease. Frost could hear the sickening sound of corrosive ichor dripping from their appendages, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. As they neared the cargo hold's entrance, Frost risked a glance over his shoulder. His stomach churned at the sight of the horde of creatures closing in, their movements fluid and fast. He knew that if they didn't make it out in time, they would be torn to shreds by the monstrous predators. With a surge of adrenaline, Frost lunged for the door controls, slamming his palm against the panel. The heavy doors groaned open, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. The crew dove through the opening, gasping for breath as they stumbled into the relative safety of the passageway. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. The creatures' unsettling hisses and clicks filled the air, their sinuous forms writhing in the shadows just beyond the cargo hold's entrance. Frost knew that they were trapped, with nowhere to run and no escape from the relentless predators that had claimed the Celestia as their hunting ground. He looked into the eyes of his crew, their faces etched with fear and determination. They were on the brink of despair, their hopes of salvage and survival slipping through their fingers like sand. But in that moment, Frost vowed that he would do whatever it took to protect his crew, even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. As the nightmarish creatures prepared to strike, the air filled with the acrid scent of fear and the faint, flickering hope that somehow, against all odds, they might just survive this harrowing ordeal. Captain Frost's heart pounded in his chest as the nightmarish creatures surged forward, their razor-sharp appendages slicing through the air with deadly precision. He raised his plasma rifle, firing a burst of white-hot energy that momentarily halted the creature's advance. The air stank of burnt flesh and singed chitin, but the reprieve was short-lived. More creatures poured into the cargo hold, their guttural hisses echoing through the cramped space. "Fall back!" Frost barked, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. "We can't hold them off here!" The crew scrambled to obey, their boots clanging against the metal floor as they retreated. Frost's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. He knew that killing one creature only attracted more, their hive mind sensing the death of their kin and responding with an overwhelming surge of reinforcements. It was a vicious cycle they couldn't afford to get caught in. As they sprinted through the dimly lit corridors of the Celestia, Frost's thoughts turned to his crew. He couldn't bear the thought of losing any more of them to these monstrosities. They were his family, his responsibility, and he would do everything in his power to protect them. His eyes darted around the narrow passageway, searching for a way to slow the creature's advance. Spotting an emergency control panel, he skidded to a halt and slammed his fist against the activation button. With a deafening roar, the heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing off the section of the ship behind them. The crew pressed their backs against the cold metal wall, panting heavily as they listened to the enraged screeches of the creatures on the other side. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they might have a chance to escape this living nightmare. But the reprieve was short-lived. The creature's inhuman strength tore through the barricade, their razored limbs shredding the metal like tissue paper. Frost's heart sank as he realized the terrible truth. There was no escape from these relentless predators. "Keep moving!" he shouted, pushing his crew forward with a desperate determination. "We have to find a way off this ship before it's too late." As they sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors of the Celestia, Frost's thoughts turned grim. He knew that their chances of survival were slim, but he refused to give up hope. They would fight until their last breath, clawing and scratching for every inch of ground they could gain against these monstrous foes. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to turn the tables on the nightmarish creatures that had claimed the Celestia as their hunting ground. In the dimly lit airlock chamber, the crew of the Carina huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The echoing hisses of the creatures grew louder as they closed in, razor-sharp appendages scraping against the metal corridors. Captain Alec Frost's eyes darted nervously between the control panel and the small window revealing the cold expanse of space beyond. With trembling hands, Katarina Holm, the ship's engineer, initiated the airlock seal. The whirring of machinery filled the air as the outer door began to close, a tantalizing promise of safety just out of reach. But the respite was short-lived. A sudden, frenzied screech pierced the air as one of the abominations lunged through the narrowing gap. Its slick, chitinous body slithered into the chamber, razored limbs slicing through the air with deadly precision. Frost's heart leapt into his throat, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Seal the inner door!" he bellowed, drawing his sidearm and leveling it at the creature. The others scrambled to obey, their panicked movements frantic and jerky. The creature advanced, undeterred by the weapon pointed at it, its multifaceted eyes locked onto Frost with malevolent intent. Frost squeezed the trigger, the gun's report deafening in the enclosed space. The creature shrieked, recoiling momentarily, but the shot only seemed to enrage it further. He fired again, the rounds tearing into its armored flesh, but still, it pressed forward. In a desperate bid to protect his crew, Frost lunged at the creature, grappling with its writhing form. The airlock chamber grew slick with the creature's corrosive ichor as they struggled, the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh filling the air. With a surge of strength born from sheer determination, Frost managed to pin the creature against the wall, his sidearm pressed to its grotesque skull. "Seal the door now!" he roared, his voice hoarse and strained. Katarina's hands flew over the control panel, and with a hiss of hydraulics, the inner door slid shut, cutting off the creature's reinforcements. Frost squeezed the trigger one last time, the shot echoing through the chamber as the creature's skull exploded in a shower of viscous fluid. Breathing heavily, Frost released the lifeless form, his heart pounding in his chest. The airlock was secure, but the cost had been high. As the crew gathered in the command deck of the Carina, assessing their injuries and losses, the weight of their situation bore down on them like a crushing force. Dr. Alara Quinn lay motionless on the floor, her once vibrant green eyes now glassy and lifeless. The crew stood around her, their faces etched with grief and shock. Frost knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against her cold, still hand. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered a silent farewell, the enormity of their loss striking him like a physical blow. Frost's thoughts raced as he struggled to process the devastating turn of events. They had boarded the Celestia with hopes of salvage and discovery, but instead, they had found only death and horror. His mind reeled with questions. How had these creatures come to be? What had driven them to such monstrous savagery? And perhaps most importantly, how could they hope to survive against such an unstoppable foe? As the crew mourned the loss of their dear friend and colleague, Frost vowed that he would not let her sacrifice be in vain. He would find a way to defeat these abominations, no matter the cost. With gritted teeth and a steely resolve, he turned his gaze toward the stars, the cold, unforgiving void staring back at him like a silent challenge. "We will find a way to stop them," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ship's engines. "We will honor Alara's memory, and we will ensure that no one else has to suffer at the hands of these monsters." His crew looked to him, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that the nightmare was far from over. But in that moment, they found solace in the unwavering determination of their captain, the man who had guided them through countless perils and always managed to find a way to prevail. Together, they would face the horrors that lay ahead, their bond forged in the fires of tragedy and loss. And perhaps, in the depths of that terrible darkness, they would find the strength to emerge victorious, their spirits unbroken and their resolve unshaken. But for now, they could only mourn the fallen and prepare for the battle that loomed on the horizon. The nightmarish creatures that haunted the Celestia would not rest, and neither could they. The fight for survival had only just begun. The command deck of the Carina was a flurry of activity as the crew worked tirelessly to devise a plan to eliminate the alien threat. Captain Alec Frost stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the console, his mind racing with possible solutions. Beside him, Katarina Holmes' sharp blue eyes scanned the ship's schematics, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to initiate the self-destruct sequence," Frost announced, his voice measured and calm despite the gravity of the situation. "It's our only chance to destroy both ships and eradicate the creatures." Katarina nodded in agreement, her expression resolute. "We'll need to rig an incendiary device to ensure maximum damage." Frost turned to Zeke Freeman and Ari Sato, who stood nearby, their faces etched with determination. "Zeke, Ari, I need you to work on that incendiary device. We'll need to jettison it into the Celestia before the self-destruct sequence is initiated." Zeke's deep-set eyes flashed with understanding. "You can count on us, Captain." Ari's brown eyes sparkled with determination. "We'll make it happen." As Zeke and Ari set to work, Frost turned to Elena Martinez, who stood at the ready, her fingers poised over her console. "Elena, I need you to gather supplies and prepare for the final stand. We'll have to hold out long enough to ensure the device is in place before we make our escape." Elena's sharp brown eyes met Frost's, her expression steady. "Understood, Captain." The crew split up, each member focused on their assigned task. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional clang of metal or the soft hum of the ship's engines. Frost couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as he thought of Dr. Alara Quinn, her life tragically cut short by the nightmarish creatures that now haunted the Celestia. But there was no time for mourning. Not yet. The survival of the crew depended on their ability to work together and execute their plan flawlessly. Frost took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over his crew as they worked with fierce determination. He knew that they would face unimaginable horrors in the hours to come, but he also knew that they had the strength and resilience to emerge victorious. As the crew worked against the clock, Frost couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the creatures that lurked in the shadows. But he refused to let fear take hold, focusing instead on the task at hand. He knew that the lives of his crew members depended on his ability to remain calm and make the right decisions, no matter the cost. And so, with grim determination etched on their faces, the crew of the Carina prepared for the final stand against the nightmarish creatures that threatened their very existence. The odds were stacked against them, but they refused to give in to despair. In the depths of that terrible darkness, they would find the strength to fight on, their spirits unbroken and their resolve unshaken. For the sake of Dr. Alara Quinn and the countless others who had fallen victim to the horrors of space, they would not go quietly into the night. They would stand their ground, and they would fight to the bitter end. And perhaps, in the process, they would find a way to turn the tide against the monstrous forces that sought to destroy them. But for now, all they could do was prepare, and pray that their plan would be enough to save them from the nightmare that lay ahead. In the cramped confines of the Carina's engineering bay, Zeke Freeman's brow glistened with sweat as he hunched over the incendiary device. His calloused fingers fumbled with the wiring, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. He glanced up at Ari Sato, who was frantically tapping away on a nearby console, her expression a mask of intense focus. "Ari, how much time do we have left?" Zeke's voice was gruff, betraying the strain of the moment. "Just under 5 minutes," she replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. "But I can't guarantee the stability of the charge. We need to move now." Zeke nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He knew the risks, but there was no other choice. They had to trust that their makeshift weapon would do its job and buy them enough time to escape. Across the ship, Captain Alec Frost, Katarina Holm, and Elena Martinez were making their final preparations. As they gathered the last of the supplies, the tension in the air was palpable. Frost's weathered face was etched with concern, but his eyes held a steely resolve. He knew that the lives of his crew depended on his ability to lead them through this harrowing ordeal. "Katarina, have you armed the self-destruct sequence?" Frost asked, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Yes, Captain," she replied, her calm demeanor belying the urgency of their situation. "We'll have 30 seconds to evacuate once it's activated." Frost nodded, then turned to Elena. "Martinez, are the escape pods prepped and ready?" "Affirmative, Captain," she responded, her voice firm. "We'll be able to jettison the device and make our escape as soon as Freeman and Sato join us." As the seconds ticked away, the crew steeled themselves for the task ahead. They knew that the nightmarish creatures that had claimed the Celestia were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. But they refused to be intimidated. They were the crew of the Carina, and they would not go down without a fight. Back in the engineering bay, Zeke and Ari finished their work on the incendiary device. Their hands shook as they attached it to a small drone, which would carry it into the heart of the Celestia and detonate upon impact. "It's ready," Zeke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get the hell out of here." Ari nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Together, they sprinted through the dark, twisting corridors of the Carina, the incendiary device clutched tightly in their grasp. They could hear the distant sounds of the creatures, their guttural growls echoing through the ship like a chilling warning. As they reached the airlock, the rest of the crew was waiting for them, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. Captain Frost activated the self-destruct sequence, and the countdown began. 30 seconds, he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. "Everyone, get to the escape pods, now." The crew moved with purpose, their movements a well-choreographed dance born of desperation and courage. As they scrambled into the pods, Zeke and Ari prepared to jettison the device. "Good luck," Frost said, his eyes meeting those of his crew one last time before the doors slid shut. As the pods launched from the Carina, Zeke and Ari activated the drone, sending it hurtling towards the Celestia. They watched as the small craft disappeared into the darkness, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were leaving a part of themselves behind. But they refused to give in to despair. They would honor the memory of their fallen comrades by surviving, by fighting to the very end. They would not allow the horrors of space to claim another victim. As the escape pods streaked towards the stars, the crew of the Carina braced themselves for the inevitable explosion. They knew that their journey was far from over, that they still had many challenges to face. But for now, they were alive, and they were together. And that was enough. The airlock's metal floor vibrated under their boots as Zeke and Ari secured the incendiary device. Captain Frost's voice crackled over the intercom. 10 seconds until self-destruct. Brace for impact. Katarina Holmes' gaze darted between the countdown display and the dark portal leading to the Celestia. She tightened her grip on the energy rifle, her knuckles whitening. A sudden, chilling hiss echoed through the corridor. The nightmarish creatures were upon them. Captain Frost roared, "Hold the line!" as the first wave of the creatures surged forward. The airlock transformed into a cramped battleground, the clash of razor-sharp appendages and energy weapons illuminating the space with an eerie, deadly glow. Katarina's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and survival instincts. She fought back-to-back with Captain Frost, their movements synchronized as they defended the bioweapon. Each swing of her makeshift improvised pike, crafted from a Celestia workstation component, sent a shudder down her spine, but she refused to yield. 5, 4, 3. The creatures closed in, their corrosive ichor spattering the airlock's walls. The stench of decay and death filled the air, a potent reminder of the horrors they faced. 2. 1. In a desperate final act, Captain Frost heaved the bioweapon into the void, just as the self-destruct sequence reached 0. The airlock's outer door slid open, revealing the looming Celestia. As the incendiary device detonated, a brilliant flash consumed the derelict ship. A torrent of deadly pathogen engulfed the nightmarish creatures, their shrill screeches piercing the silence before being swallowed by the void. Captain Frost slumped against the airlock's frame, his uniform singed and torn. He locked eyes with Katarina, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Get them home, Kat," he whispered, his voice strained. With a heavy heart, Katarina nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. As the Carina disintegrated into a cloud of debris and toxic fumes, she steeled herself for the challenges ahead, determined to honor Captain Frost's sacrifice and lead the surviving crew to safety. The command deck of the Carina was an eerie tableau of devastation. Shattered console screens flickered with the ghostly remnants of emergency protocols, casting a sickly green glow over the somber faces of the survivors. The acrid smell of burnt circuitry hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Katarina Holm, her uniform tattered and her face etched with grief, stood at the center of the room. She gazed at the flickering holographic image of Captain Alec Frost, frozen in time as he hurled the bioweapon into the void. The sight of her mentor's lifeless body, slumped against the airlock, was seared into her memory. Captain Frost. Zeke Freeman's voice trailed off, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He clutched the handle of his makeshift pike, the once pristine white Celestia workstation component now stained with ichor. Ari Sato, her fingers trembling as she typed on a still-functioning console, looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to honor his sacrifice. We need to make it back home." Elena Martinez nodded, her gaze sweeping over the room. The weight of their responsibility pressed heavily upon her. "We'll tell their stories," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll make sure the world knows what we faced and what we lost." As the survivors shared hushed condolences, Katarina's thoughts drifted to the man who had led them through the void. A man who had faced the unimaginable horrors of deep space and had given his life so that they might live. He was more than just our captain, she thought. He was our family. The crew's somber vigil was interrupted by the sudden crackle of static from the communication console. A garbled voice cut through the silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline through the room. "Carina, do you copy? This is the SS Pioneer. We've detected your distress signal. Please respond." Elena rushed to the console, her hands shaking as she keyed in their response. "This is the Carina. We read you, Pioneer. Stand by for evac procedures." As the rescue crew prepared to board the Carina, Katarina led her crew in a final salute to their fallen captain. Tears streamed down their faces as they recited the words of the ancient mariner's prayer, a solemn vow to carry on in the face of unspeakable loss. Months later, the Carina drifted through the void, a ghost ship adrift in the cold darkness of space. The Pioneer's quarantine team had left no stone unturned, searching the ship for any trace of the nightmarish creatures that had claimed the lives of so many. In the bowels of the Pioneer's medical bay, Alec Frost lay strapped to a cold, sterile bed. His body was a patchwork of scars and sutures, a testament to the brutal ordeal he had survived. His eyes flickered open, revealing a haunted, hollow gaze that seemed to stare straight through the soul. As the medical team tended to his wounds, he murmured incoherently, his voice barely above a whisper. The words that spilled from his lips were a chilling testament to the horrors he had witnessed. Tales of grotesque creatures, of betrayal and sacrifice, and of a captain who had given everything to save his crew. The medical staff exchanged worried glances, their hearts heavy with the weight of his words. They knew that the nightmares that plagued Alec Frost's dreams would haunt them all, a grim reminder of the darkness that lurked in the farthest reaches of space. In the dimly lit medical bay of the Pioneer, a somber silence hung heavy in the air as the surviving crew members of the Carina gathered around Alec Frost's bedside. His labored breathing and the soft hum of the life support machines were the only sounds that filled the room. Katarina Holm, her eyes reddened from tears, clenched her fists as she stared at her captain. "We should have never boarded that damned ship," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of anger and grief. Zeke Freeman, his face etched with lines of exhaustion, shook his head. "We had no choice, Kat. We needed the resources. We were desperate." He looked at his hands, still bearing the scars from the frantic repairs he'd made to the Carina in the heat of the crisis. Draven Kincaid, their eccentric scientist, stood apart from the group, their unsettling gaze fixed on Frost. The creatures, they were unlike anything we've ever encountered. Their biology, their behavior, they were a nightmare made flesh. They spoke in a hushed tone, as if afraid to awaken the very horrors they had barely escaped. Dr. Alara Quinn, her own composure shaken, looked at her crewmates with a haunted expression. "We need to learn from this, to prepare ourselves for future encounters with hostile alien life. We can't afford to let our guard down again." Alec Frost's weak voice suddenly cut through the air, startling the crew. "I'm sorry. I failed you." He coughed, wincing in pain. "I couldn't save everyone." Katarina's eyes welled up with tears as she leaned over him, her hand gently brushing his hair. "No, Captain. You saved us. You sacrificed yourself so we could live." As Frost's eyes slowly closed, the room fell silent once more. The weight of their losses and the lessons learned from their harrowing experience settled upon them like a heavy shroud. They knew that their journey was far from over, and that humanity's preparedness for future encounters with hostile alien life now rested on their shoulders. In that moment, they vowed to carry on in the face of unspeakable loss, determined to honor the sacrifices made by their fallen comrades and to ensure that their nightmare would never be repeated.